Today we're going to discuss whether the driver of a rental vehicle is protected under the Fourth Amendment, or in other words, has reasonable expectation of privacy in a vehicle where he's not listed as an authorized driver in a rental agreement. The case is Byrd versus United States, and this is a 2018 Supreme Court case. And here's what happens. Mr. Byrd's friend rents a vehicle from Budget Rental Cars. She walks into the office, she fills out all the paperwork, and part of that contract states that the only person who is allowed to use the vehicle is the renter himself, her spouse, or anyone who fills out an additional addendum authorizing that person to drive the vehicle. When Mr. Byrd's friend leaves the office, she immediately hands the keys to Mr. Byrd, who then becomes the sole occupant and driver of the vehicle. He takes the car to his own residence, he puts his personal belongings in the trunk, and he then proceeds to drive to whatever destination he was going to. On his way, he gets pulled over by the police. The officers state that the reason why he got pulled over is because both of his hands were on 10 and 2. He was leaning too far back from the steering wheel, and he was driving a rental car. That's it. Now, during the conversation with the police, the officers asked Mr. Byrd if they have his consent to search the vehicle. Remember, consent is one of the exceptions to the Fourth Amendment requirement to get a warrant. Now, during the conversation, eventually the police tell him that they don't need Mr. Byrd's consent. Because he's not listed in the rental contract, he does not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that vehicle. So they search the car anyway. They find narcotics and body armor in the trunk of the car. Now the question becomes, were they allowed to open the trunk and search the vehicle even though Mr. Byrd was not listed on that contract? Or does he have a Fourth Amendment right after all? The Fourth Amendment protects you against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, to make that search a reasonable one, the officers can always get a warrant. And of course, we've been through a ton of cases where we dealt with exceptions to that warrant requirement. Now, let's review some of those cases. In Katz, we learned that the Fourth Amendment protects you only if you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Now I have a video on Katz, and I will link it here above, so I encourage you to watch it. And of course, from a 1991 case, California versus Acevedo, we've learned that individuals have a diminished expectation of privacy in their own vehicles because we're using these cars on public roads. So the question is, does Mr. Byrd have a Fourth Amendment right in a rented vehicle where he's not an authorized driver? Well, here's the two schools of thought. Number one is the reasonable expectation of privacy. But the court reminds us that we always have to look at the trespass laws and really property laws when we're dealing with the Fourth Amendment. If a person has a legal right to possess or own a vehicle or control a vehicle, he will have an expectation of privacy in it. One of the main rights attaching to property is the right to exclude others. And that's really the essence of the expectation of privacy.
The court now holds that, as a general rule, someone in otherwise lawful possession and control of a rental car has a reasonable expectation of privacy in it. And this is true even if the rental agreement does not list him or her as an authorized driver.
Now, the government makes a couple of arguments in this case. Number one, they say that Mr. Byrd is more like a thief because he was never listed in the rental agreement. But we know that's not true. Mr. Byrd was allowed to drive the vehicle by the friend, even if they never told the rental company that he would have been the main driver. Now, the second argument that the government makes is that Mr. Byrd and the friend had sort of a conspiracy where she would have never been driving the car And it's really Mr. Byrd who would have been the driver, because he's the one using this vehicle to transport narcotics. Now, the Supreme Court tells us that the government did not make that argument in the courts below. And so they're going to remand it if there's any other crimes involved in this case. And for viewers that often leave comments under my videos saying, what about this other exception? Doesn't the automobile exception apply in this case? And that's true. I often neglect to tell you what happens to the case after the Supreme Court rendered their decision. And in this case, the Supreme Court remanded the case to the lower level to address the question whether the police officers had probable cause to search the vehicle anyway. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please click like, subscribe, hit that bell notification button so next time I post, you'll be first to know.